am Abhishek Raj. On the behalf of Vande Matram, I welcome you all to today's event. The topic of the talk today is Ushering the Indic Renaissance. Before starting the program, I'll request all of you to stand and sing the national song Vande Matram at your place. Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram, Sujalam Sufalam, Malayaj Sheetalam, Shashya Shyamalam, Mataram, Vande Mataram, Shubhra Jyotsna Pulkit Yaminim, Pullakusumit Drumdal Shobhinim, Suhasinim Sumadur Bhashinim, Sukhdam Vardam Mataram, Vande Mataram. Before starting the event, let's keep silent for 2 minutes for the student which we have lost from IIT Madras, Prem Avinash, who was the third year dual degree student from mechanical engineering, and we'll pray for his best wishes, whatever from our side. We can close our eyes and keep the silence for 2 minutes and then pray for him. May the God give him salvation to make him free of the cycle of rebirth. Give him salvation. And may all the human beings be happy, be prosperous, healthy. With this, today we have a very special personality with us, Shri J. Sai Deepak Ji with us. Shri J. Sai Deepak Ji is a lawyer in Delhi High Court and Supreme Court, and he has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Manya University, and then LLB degree from IIT Kharagpur. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Shri J. Sai Deepak Ji. With a big round of applause. Please have a seat. Yes. So, as per our Indian tradition, I would like to invite Professor Jyotirmay Tripathi Ji to welcome our guest on the behalf of IIT Madras by presenting the fruit basket. Now, I would request our guest, Sri J. Sai Deepak Ji, to address the audience. Thank you, sir.
Am I audible? Yes, okay. So I see quite a few familiar faces here. If it's okay, may I just request some members of the audience to come to the front? It'll help me focus on the audience much better. Since I'm a product of IIT, I know that if the number of minimum students is 5 in a certain program, then the program is allowed to function. So I think I've crossed that minimum threshold. So to that extent, I think I'm entitled to conduct or give this particular lecture or talk, whatever you call it. How many undergrads do we have here? Okay. There's a word for MTech in IIT Kharagpur. They're called matkas. I'm not sure if that's the lingo that's used here. How many MTechs do we have here? Any MTechs? Masters? Okay. How many PhDs? Great. Okay. Can anyone explain to me what is the significance of the poster? Shankaracharya is very visible. Who do you suspect is the other gentleman he's debating with? Mandan Mishra. That much is clear. Okay. Now, why is this relevant to the topic? How is the poster relevant to the topic? Wife, that's true. Declared Shankaracharya the winner. Right. But the tradition of debating, how is it relevant to today's topic? What do you think is the connection? How would you draw the link between the two? What is the nexus? Right. 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 I'll build from that. At least in the earlier times, there was the decency of agreeing on the rules of the debate. There was the decency of agreeing what shall be the terms of the debate and what metrics would be applied to decide who has won and who has lost. Today, that's no more the case. It's a question of competing narratives. It's a question of who can shout the loudest, who has access to the best megaphones available, who has the most prevalent ecosystem in order for him to reach out to the maximum number of people. What does this tell you? That a civilized debate perhaps is a concept of a bygone era, a debate where people can at least admit or concede defeat is not possible anymore because neither party will agree that it's wrong. That's the reality of the day we live in. Why is this relevant? It's relevant to the topic at hand for the simple reason that according to me, in order for us to usher an Indic renaissance, unless and until we dig deep into our own dialectical traditions, our own traditions of debating, our own intellectual traditions, we will constantly find ourselves floundering when faced with a motivated opposition. See, each time I go and address a certain audience on the topic, I've realized that there is a certain degree of despair and despondence. There's always the constant thing that I get to hear, they seem to have access to a better media ecosystem. They seem to have access to better resources. They seem to have patronage from the best of people possible and from the powers that be. Because we don't have any of these things, our voices are not heard. And that seems to be the constant refrain in each discussion that I've been whenever I've spoken of an Indic Renaissance. Why is an Indic Renaissance necessary? What do we need to do to usher an Indic Renaissance is more or less the subject of the topic today. Let me just start off with some of my own experiences and then we'll talk about this. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to be a part of several litigations which have political and religious ramifications. Starting with the movement to free temples from the clutches of state control. I've been recently inducted into the team for the Ram Janmabhoomi case as well. And we are also leading from the forefront the litigation relating to deportation of Rohingyas. And on each of these topics, I find that anyone who takes a position which is different from the position taken by the other side, let me not name the other side for a moment, each time we take a position which is at loggerheads with theirs, we are bound to be branded and we are bound to be silenced. And the moment I'm given a certain brand, whether or not the point of view that I put forth has any merit or not, people will stop listening to me. It's come to a point where branding has become a precursor to silencing. So if I write the book, no matter how scholastically deep it may be, no matter how much of research I may have undertaken, the moment I'm told that he comes from a certain faction, he comes from a certain ideological backdrop, he represents a certain worldview, he represents a certain point of view, that will be the end of your perception as far as my work is concerned. You will not see whether the work stands on its own 2 feet as far as its merits are concerned. So in a situation such as this, what do you do? How do you make your voices heard? Why do you need to be heard in the first place? It's for a different reason. I would have actually, if let's say this kind of a poster had been used in JNU today for a similar discussion, what do you think would have been the reactions in JNU today? How do you think the audience would have reacted to it? This would have been branded a right-wing discussion. This would have been branded a right-of-center discussion. This would have been branded a communal discussion. And I would actually have law and order issues or perhaps even safety issues to deal with instead of focusing on the debate. Why has it come to this point? It's because this. I have always found in the limited experience that I have dealt with people of, let's say, the Indic consciousness or the Indic side of the society, that while we crib and whine about everything that is wrong with our side, our tendency to put in action our thought, our tendency to step on the ground and to do something about it is almost always lacking. There is a serious mismatch in the depth that we attribute to the philosophical foundations of our forefathers and our initiative or our inclination to live and practice those ideas in the first place. So for us, most of these topics have been relegated to post-dinner katha karakshepam as far as I'm concerned. Beyond that, those topics have not acquired any significance. Beyond that, those topics do not find any kind of traction. Beyond that, we don't seem to be acting on any of those ideas. If we have to usher an Indic renaissance, we need to understand why do we need it in the first place. Let me try and hit the nail on the head and try and make the audience as uncomfortable as possible on this topic. One of our principal positions in the Rohingya petition is to say that this particular group poses a certain threat as far as India is concerned. And there are reasons to believe that if these people are allowed to continue to live in this country, there is bound to be a serious demographic explosion. And we've already seen the consequences of a skewed demographic in states like Assam and in Jammu and Kashmir. And we are now welcoming this problem, we are now importing this problem, and we want to rehabilitate and settle this problem using the state's resources, which could lead to a problem. The moment we set foot in the court with this kind of a petition, within 4 to 5 days, we had a host of articles written against us in the Hindu, in the Wire, in the Scroll, in practically every publication possible, saying that this is representative of a narrow mindset, this is representative of a fascist mindset, this is representative of a conservative mindset. We were branded Sanghis for all practical purposes. Fortunately, since it happens to be a court of law, I have a right of audience, I have a right to expect the court to hear me out, and therefore, I hope that my point of view will be heard before I'm dismissed. But outside of the court, in the world of public opinion, in the court of public opinion, my point of view has already been distorted beyond recognition. It has already been destroyed beyond recognition because most people think that anyone who speaks for deportation of these people is bound to be a communal fascist. That's the reality of the day. And that takes me to the next issue, which is to say, what is wrong in propounding the concept of an Indic identity? Why is an Indic identity necessary in the first place? An Indic identity is necessary in the first place because unless and until you impute a certain identity to yourself, You allow outsiders to mold and fashion your identity. So today it is possible for anybody to get away with this nonsensical statement that India has always been a land of immigrants, and therefore there is absolutely no problem in having a second wave of immigration, regardless of what those hues may be, regardless of their origins, and what the implications could be for the future. This has been the nonsensical statement or narrative that's being peddled. So the absence of an identity or a vacuum with respect to your identity allows somebody else to cast and impose a certain identity on you. Which is why it is important for us to craft an identity for ourselves, and that is the Indic identity. What is the meaning of an Indic identity? Why are we not using any other term for it? Why Indic in the first place? Because the word Indic is capable of encompassing within its scope several ways of life, several value systems, not all of which may be able to live with each other. There is a serious difference between the Vedic way of life and the Jainic way of life, and the Buddhist way of life. All of these need to be able to be assimilated in one particular basket, and the only basket that can do this is the Indic basket. If you do not give this identity to yourself, take it from me in writing, you will find articles being written to the effect that there is not much of a difference between the United States of America and India insofar as it being a melting pot of multiple races and multiple cultures, and therefore there is no Indic way of life, and there is nothing that is native to this particular land. And the moment you try and say there is something that belongs to this particular land, you will be branded a xenophobe, someone who has a problem with anybody entering this country. Which is why it is important for you to have an Indic identity. That's point number one. But let's try and actually expand this issue a bit more. Can I walk around, or will I be less audible? Is it okay for me to walk around a bit? Yes, please, because I'm used to actually walking around when I speak. How many of you have followed the Sabarimala debate of entry or right of entry of women into Sabarimala? How many of you have followed it? Okay. And how many of you have followed the discussions on TV with respect to Sabarimala, on NDTV or any other place? Most of you, I'm hoping that most of you have actually seen it. There is always a tendency to pit Hindu religious institutions against women and give the distinct impression that by default, Hindu religious institutions are patriarchal in nature, and women are treated as inferior or second-grade institutions, and that's the manner in which this discussion goes about. Why is this important, and what is the significance of this is this. Every discussion that you view on television or any platform which has a fair amount of impact or a fair amount of access is to a normal person independent of somebody's ideology. Most people who read newspapers or who watch news do not understand that the person who's peddling that particular news or who's actually pushing that particular narrative has a certain agenda. Consequently, it comes to a point that unless and until you're in a position to have access to an ecosystem that ventilates your point of view or pushes your agenda, you will always be in a position where you'll be seen as a minority, as a fringe, or as a non-intellectual base. How many of you associate, okay, until it comes, I actually have to move on because I have an energy which needs to be disseminated. Oh, it's recording, okay. Every time you watch a debate on television, let's say on NDTV, you'll always find 3 articulate people speaking immaculate English, representing a certain point of view, and anyone who represents the Indic standpoint or the Indic point of view will be a person who is inarticulate, who struggles with English, and who will come out as a person who is a misogynist of the first order, who is a patriarch of the first order. Have you wondered why this is the case? This is simply because, in my limited experience when I've taken part in NDTV debates, I've seen that there is a calculated attempt to push a certain stereotype with respect to the Indic point of view, and we are also partly responsible for this. You speak of gay rights, you speak of tribal rights, or you speak of rights of women, the Indic standpoint is never there at all. The Indic position never finds any ventilation at all. You're not seen.
Since you raised that point, I want to ask you, since you participated in NDTV debate,
Yes, sir.
the people who are called depend on the channel, right?
Correct.
So they might choose such people who will kind of support their.
That's exactly my point. I don't know if I'm still audible.
Yes, fine. It's fine.
Volume? No, there it's not still. Okay. You're right. That's exactly what happens.
You can walk now.
I'm not sure it's still connected to the camera. Is it? Okay. There's no connection with that camera. I'll use this one. Yes, sir. Repeat your question again, please. Yeah. Yes, they decide. So this is what I would.
I in fact many times wonder
Right.
why do the people who are called come there if they know that.
There's a reason for it. There's a reason for it. If I know for a fact that I'm going to be outnumbered in a discussion with people from the other side of the ideological fence, it's all the more reason for me to go there. Otherwise, the impression that most audience will get is that this is the only point of view that exists and there is no alternative point of view. Notwithstanding the fact that I'll be isolated or I will be a minority voice as far as that particular discussion is concerned, I'm hoping that people get to hear even my point of view before they form an opinion on that particular issue. I understand. Now, right. It's here. I'll put it this way. I may call a certain person knowing fully well that he is going to be inarticulate and he will succeed or he will help me pushing a certain point of view that these are the people and these people fundamentally represent a sample which is inarticulate. But I can't stop a person who wants to appear before a television channel to put forth his point of view, notwithstanding the fact that he knows for a fact that he is not the best person to represent that point of view. Ultimately, it boils down to one thing. I need to be absolutely aware of the fact that am I the right person to represent a certain point of view on a public platform? If I am not articulate enough, or if I don't have the skill set, or if I'm not informed as far as that particular issue is concerned, I must desist from going there because I'm not just hurting my own reputation, I'm also hurting the reputation of the position that I stand for. Unfortunately, there's nothing that you can do. You can't stop people from appearing on television studios. You can only try and create more voices which can reach out to public, independent of what is being shown on television channels. Before we go to questions and answers, there are a couple of issues that I wanted to address. So let me just start off with those issues. One, the tendency to assume that the Indic side is a side which always holds or wields the lathi and is incapable of engaging in an intellectual discussion is not just a stereotype that is pushed by the other side, but we have also contributed to it. I'll name a few organizations and let us see what you think of those organizations. You've heard of People's Union for Civil Liberties, Human Rights Law Network. Each of these organizations are clearly not organizations which subscribe to an Indic worldview. These organizations subscribe to a left of center viewpoint. These organizations subscribe to a different ideological standpoint altogether. Why is it that in no free speech debate or in a privacy issue or on issues with respect to women's rights or with respect to LGBT rights or with respect to tribal rights or environmental issues, we are not to be found anywhere at all? For the simple reason that we have allowed these issues to be co-opted and hijacked by the other side. And two, we have never fundamentally put faith in developing our arguments within the constitutional framework. That is not an option that has been on the table for a very long time. Consequently, if you have not treated a constitutional debate as an option on the table which you have to work upon, you will always think of it as too much of an intellectualism. You will say this is too much of academic discussion which I'm not interested in. Today it has come to a point that academics and so-called Buddhijeevis are the people who are dictating the course of the national discourse on all issues of major concern, starting from deputation to privacy to whatnot. What does this show? That despite having a tradition of debating and despite having ancestors like Shankaracharya to look up to, this is a side today which has not lived up to those traditions for the simple reason that you have abandoned those traditions. We are more than happy to do the grassroots work, but we are not interested in actually developing it into a certain argument. It's important. Every issue has at least 3 or 4 layers. One is the intellectual layer, where it's an argument between 2 people who are qualified in the particular subject. Second is an argument between people who are grassroots workers, who are activists. Therefore, there has to be a different skill set which you need for that particular thing. Then there is a middle layer where you have a public intellectual who can bridge the gap between the grassroots worker and the intellectual and can reach out to the common audience. I'll give you a simple example, and this goes back to the discussion I had just before the talk. If you look at the number of articles which speak of the Ram Janmabhoomi case or the verdict of the Allahabad High Court of 2011, most of them peddle this particular belief that the decision is based on the concept of faith. That the decision was ultimately delivered in favor of Hindus only because of faith. As opposed to the fact that the decision runs into at least 3,000 pages, most of which is based on archaeological evidence, most of which is based on expert testimony, most of which is based on historical sources. Why is this important? Because thanks to the power of narrative and thanks to the fact that some of these people act as gatekeepers of media and whatnot, they have successfully managed to push the argument that because 2 people out of the 3 judges were Hindus, therefore the decision of the Allahabad High Court was entirely based on faith, as opposed to the actual evidence which the judges considered for years together. This is the power of narrative, and this is the power of having an intellectual ecosystem at your disposal. Why is this important? Facts entirely go to the dustbin and narrative takes over the moment you have an ecosystem which is capable of reaching out to the public. How many of you who have actually read or let's say have heard of the Ram Janmabhoomi case have managed to pick up the judgment and read it? It's publicly available, anybody can read it. Instead, we choose to go with information that is given to us through the media. And the media has managed to convince us that as far as this judgment is concerned, it was based entirely on faith. We have not even asked this commonsensical question. At the end of the day, it's a court of law. How can a court of law come out with a verdict on facts and law based entirely on faith without evidence to support its conclusions? This defies logic, doesn't it? If the judgment is fundamentally based only on faith and does not have any basis or foundation in facts or in evidence and or law, how is it that it has been passed in the first place by a court of law? Then the judgment is fundamentally ridiculous is the conclusion that you have to come out with, which is not the case. Because if it is that ridiculous, the Supreme Court would have reversed it. All this shows what? Today, we whine, we gripe, and we constantly complain about the lack of an ecosystem, using all sorts of excuses available to us saying we don't have the material resources. Although there is a certain dispensation in power today, it has not committed those resources to patronizing a certain intellectual ecosystem. But the fact of the matter is this: any support that comes from the state can only encourage an existing talent pool. Where is the talent pool that we have created today? The state cannot create talent. The state can only encourage talent. The state can only act as a force multiplier as far as an existing talent pool is concerned. How many of us have taken serious interest in Indology, in coming out with textbooks which are not written by foreigners as far as our history is concerned? Why is it that every major textbook and every major commentary on Indic studies comes from people who are not from Indian institutions and who are not of Indian origin? Because we have entirely abandoned it. One of the fundamental reasons that we find ourselves in the situation is we have lost the battle as far as humanities is concerned. We are so hell-bent on churning out engineers and medical professionals and people of all sorts of views except in the humanities side. You have allowed humanities to be taken over by someone with a vested interest without realizing that humanities constantly affects your life on a daily basis. if you're watching television, if you're watching a news channel, or if you're reading a history textbook, or if you're reading something related to literature, each of these things relate to humanities. If you look at people from our side today, so-called Indic side, who are focusing on humanities, we have done it only on a part-time voluntary basis. And then after the age of 50, after having earned all the wealth that we can, we then decide that I need to dedicate my life to this particular side, and then I start becoming an expert on history, on Sanskrit and whatnot. Compare that with the other side, and you have the answer crystal clear right in front of you as to why we are where we are today. You go to this place called Bastar. How many of you have heard of this place called Bastar? Why is that place famous for? McDonald's? No. What is it famous for? No, it's otherwise the red belt. For all practical reasons, it's the red belt. Go to Bastar and ask yourself, how many groups which are left of center are based out of Bastar, and how many groups which are right of center are based out of Bastar? We are nowhere to be found in the field. We are nowhere there at all. Law students, young law students have managed, or even young students of any humanity groups, they have been successfully packaged and sold this idea that free speech belongs to this particular camp, that civil liberties belongs to this particular camp, and therefore they're inclined to go there. Every idealistic impulse of a youngster is being tapped into by this particular side, whereas we are busy talking about justifying caste system and whatnot. You take every major publication on the right of center, their pet issues will be only this. One, Article 370. Point number one. How do you abolish reservations? Point number two. Point number three. No, the caste system is bad today, but that was not the original intention. We try and justify the past without understanding that you need to choose issues of the present for you to be relevant and for you to be able to reach out to people today. What the caste system was 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, does it really matter to a person who is actually, let's say, a victim of that particular system in any part of the country? It doesn't make a difference to him. You can keep shouting and crowing till the cows come home about the origins of the caste system or how great it was when it came out, but unless and until your action or your initiative is consistent with your belief, then you're all talk and no action. Now, let's look at also another system. Indians, by default, are driven by incentives. We are creatures of incentives. Unless and until there is an angle or there is a certain aspect which is helpful to you on the personal front, you really don't take the initiative. The other side has successfully managed to cultivate scholarships, fellowships, programs, incentives, all of which are fashionable. They are packaged in the best format possible. They are given the scholarly depth necessary, even if it's based on flimsy foundations, so that people aspire for it. There are, at any given point of time, there are so many students across universities, across streams, who aspire for Rhodes scholarships. Give me one example of a Rhodes scholarship which India has come out with in order to attract the best of brains from across the streams. You don't have a comparable scholarship at all. And if you were to read into the history of the Rhodes Scholarship, it was set up by perhaps one of the most racist persons of his time. And yet today, Rhodes Scholarship has become a symbol of egalitarian, universalist, and libertarian values. This is the power of narrative, where you're entitled to recraft and refashion history to suit your current agenda. We may have managed to understand how to crack the game of elections. We may have managed to come out with a decent machinery that wins one state after another. But at the end of the day, as far as the public narrative is concerned, and as far as the messaging is concerned, and as far as the intellectual ecosystem is concerned, you're nowhere close to it. For the simple reason that you have not invested sufficiently in it. And importantly, it is not the job of people on the Indic side or on the right of center side to defend the government. That's not your primary priority. That is not what you're meant for. Governments will come, governments will go. Dispensations will come, dispensations will go. You are fighting for a certain idea, you're fighting for a certain idea of India, you're fighting for an Indic civilizational narrative which has to transcend governments and time. Which means, and if I could give a very crude, unpopular example, or perhaps a politically incorrect example, it is rumored that the Communist Party of China has a civilizational narrative going for the next 100 years as to how it wants to be seen for the next 100 years. Regardless of who is in power, there is a consistency in terms of what China is and how it projects itself, what are its interests, and how does it go about protecting those interests. But as far as we are concerned, there is no Indic civilizational narrative. We do not have a clear picture as to who we are. We do not have a clear picture as to how do we represent ourselves to the world from a civilizational standpoint. We have not actually crafted that particular identity at all. This may be for a different reason also. Perhaps before India was politically united and became India as we know it today, each of these princely states and each of these regions may have had an individual identity. But the fact remains that at least for the outsider and the traveler who's come to this part of the world, he has seen a cultural commonality as far as all parts of the country are concerned. Therefore, whether or not there was this political concept of India which existed before 1947, the notion of India and the idea of India existed. Unfortunately, those building blocks of identity have not been used. We have not built on that particular identity because creation of an identity has very tangible consequences. Let's say today if I were to come out with a foreign policy or an immigration policy which says, I will not accept refugees into this country who come of a certain background, or I give it a positive twist. Only those refugees coming from an Indic background, meaning thereby Buddhists, Sikhs, Chakmas, Hindus, these are the only people, or Jains will be the only people who will be given the status of refugee as far as India is concerned. All others will be treated as illegal immigrants. What do you think will be the first public reaction to this, at least through the media? There will be a huge outcry that this is a communal position. They will say this is an anti-minority position. They will give it all sorts of names. That is for the simple reason that till date, after 70 years of the creation of this Republic of India, you still don't have a clear cultural identity, you do not have a civilizational narrative to present. You continue to allow third parties to craft your narrative. You have given them all the room that they need. Therefore, as far as I am concerned, the need of the hour is this. Perhaps the last wave was based on part-time volunteerism where people out of their good intention decided to do something for the Indic side. After the age of 50, after the age of 40. But now you have arrived at a point where the battle of ideologies is visible for you to see on a day-to-day basis on every topic. Right from the murder of journalists, to immigration crisis, to reservations, to whatnot. Almost everything in India revolves around identity politics. Therefore, it has come to a point where you really need to give it its due and take an interest in it and start investing in it. Which means the next wave as far as the Indic Renaissance is concerned must consist of people who devote themselves to this cause full-time. You need full-time journalists. You need full-time historians, full-time Indologists, full-time lawyers, people who take an active interest in this and build on this particular thing. So, which is why over the last few months, we have as a group constituted an entity called the Indic Collective. The Indic Collective is basically an organization which is meant to give a constitutional response, a democratic response, an intellectual response to the other side. I'll give you a simple example, and perhaps it's a very politically incorrect example to give, but be that as it may, I'll give it. It is rumored that the number of branches that the RSS has in this country is about 70,000. 60 to 70,000 is the number. And I'm giving a rough figure that each branch has at least 10 people. What does that translate to? 7 lakh people across the country? This is an organization that constantly bleats and groans about Sanskrit not getting its due in this country. That Sanskrit is not adopted, it's not spoken, And they've always called themselves the guardians of this particular language. I have a simple question to ask. 70,000 into 10 is 7 lakh. How many of these 7 lakh people have been taught Sanskrit by the RSS itself? An organization which wants the rest of the country to learn this language itself has not deemed it important to teach the language to its own people. What does it say? As far as a third party is concerned, this is a hypocritical position. You want the rest of the world to learn this language, but you have not been able to teach this language to your own people when you have specific wings which are dedicated to the teaching of this language. I'm sure people have heard of this branch called the Samskrita Bharati. You have a wing dedicated to it, but you've not taught it. Second, there is a fundamental inferiority complex on the Indic side, which needs to be overcome. You can continue to gripe about the other side, but unless and until you know how the other side operates, you will not be in a position to respond to it. If you vilify English, you have effectively given them complete hold over English media. If you say that English does not belong to this country, you live in the age of dinosaurs because you fail to understand that whether you like it or not, English has become a popular language in this country. The very same people, when pushed to the wall, they'll say, no, English has several words that comes from Sanskrit. Then is it your position that English is an Indian language or not? At least clarify that. You can't say that English has several words which come from Sanskrit and also say that English is a foreign language. But on a more practical level, you have not learnt the art of mastering the rules of the game so that you're in a position to respond to them and then decide the rules of the game yourself. When you're in a position of weakness, the first thing that you're supposed to do is this. Understand the rules of the game that have been set by the other side, master the rules of the game, and then aspire to come to a point where you're in a position to change the rules of the game yourself. But at least until that particular point of time, you need to continue to play by those rules until you're in a better stage to alter the rules of the game. Every time I go to a discussion, every time I go to any of these these discussions and seminars, the first thing that they say is, somehow the English media is against us. Somehow the Lutyens media is against us. The Lutyens media, for all practical purposes, has no reason to be for you or against you. It is only going in the direction where power sways. It is only going in the direction where money exists and where there is influence. Whoever is willing to give them importance, whoever is willing to cultivate them, you'll have them. Today you have a different voice altogether. Now, fortunately, you have a voice through Republic, where you're able to put forth your point of view. Therefore, what does it show? It's not impossible for you to create your voice. It's not impossible for you to create your own platform. But you need to understand the importance of creating a platform. You need to understand that this is very, very important. Unless and until you realize the value of a constitutional argument or a dialectical debate, you will always be anti-intellectual, you will always be afraid of an argument, you will always flounder when you're called to debate on all the positions that you hold. Let's ask ourselves this simple question. On the aspect of whether India is or is not a country of Hindu origins, if a public debate were to be held today, how many voices from the Indic side can we identify who can hold their own against the best of voices which the other side can field and prove their point of view in a language that they understand? Handful. It's literally a handful. Therefore, the Indic Renaissance or the civilizational renaissance that we speak of is not going to come only at the ground level, or it's not going to happen at one level. It has to happen at multiple levels. 1,000 different revolutions, 1,000 different mini revolutions have to bloom and blossom across the country. If at all, there has to be an Indic Renaissance in the future. And for that to happen, you need to master the art of debating, the art of articulation, the art of building an argument, and giving depth to your argument. Every time you speak of Sanskrit, there is always one gentleman who says that even NASA or some other organization has recognized that Sanskrit is the best language for computer programming. That is all we know about Sanskrit. Beyond that, we know jack. Is that true? Does it have a basis? Is it scientifically verifiable? Or is this hearsay? Was this a random statement made in some article? Or was the entire article dedicated to this particular issue? Has anybody undertaken that particular research? That is our problem. We seem to be purveyors of myths, or at least we don't know how to prove that something is not a myth. Somebody constantly hails this as a slur at you. You're an idol worshipper, you're a cow worshipper. Either you repel that and say, I'm not this, or you try and prove why this is the case and why there is nothing to be ashamed about. But you will never do that for the simple reason that you would rather hide under a rock and evade that particular argument than meet that argument head on. And that is the reason that each time you run away from a certain discussion, you are gradually encouraging within yourself the inability to repel an argument on an intellectual level. Unless and until you hone the ability and sharpen the ability to constantly engage with the other side, you will never be in a position to win the hearts and minds of the popular public. Let me give you a simple example. And I'm just drawing from one of the examples that we were discussing. We have all read about the murder of the sad and tragic murder of this lady called Gauri Lankesh in Karnataka. You've read this. Is that the only journalist who has died this year? Is that the only journalist who has been murdered or assassinated who has met with an unnatural death? No. How is it that this particular issue has found such a huge traction and every other death of any other journalist, either English or non-English speaking journalist, has never reached the mass audience at all? What does this tell you? Let me give you one more example. Whenever you think of, let's say, a missionary organization or a church, two institutions immediately come to your head when you think of a church: a school and a hospital. Correct? You think of a church, the moment the first thing that comes to your head is a school and a hospital, or at least an orphanage and let's say a home for the elderly. Have you ever asked yourself, why don't temples have similar institutions? The lazy conclusion that most people arrive at is, philanthropy is a concept which is alien to Hindus, and philanthropy is a concept which is alien to temples. Temples are only interested in covering their gods and their spires in gold and silver, and they have no interest in doing anything for the common society. We will always speak and give the example of a langar of a gurudwara, or the church and hospital, or the hospital and school of a church, but we will not have such comparable examples to give as far as a temple is concerned. Have we ever asked ourselves, why is this reason? Why does it exist this way? What is the reason for this state of affairs? That is something that has been lost in the sands of time. Most people don't even know who controls the wealth that comes from the temple. Who controls the resources of the temple? Why is it that you have a Hindu endowments board in every secular government, state government, but you don't find similar establishments or similar ministries for places of worship of other communities? What does this tell you? We have not taken an interest in this. It doesn't matter to us. We are fundamentally survivalists. We are fundamentally individualists. As long as you have greener pastures to go after, and you're in a position to secure your own nest, you're in a position to feather your own nest, you have no interest in seeing beyond that. Please remember that there are 3 stages that a civilization goes through, usually. 1, where it is aware of its identity. 2nd, where it is in the process of losing its identity. 3rd, when it completely loses its identity. And when there is a vacuum, something is bound to fill that vacuum. If you don't fill it up yourself and you create an identity for yourself, somebody else is going to do for that. So we may be progenitors of an advanced civilization, but we are certainly at an advanced stage of decay. And unless and until we we identify as to who we are and what we wish to do, in the future you will always find yourself in the politically incorrect position of defending your own faiths. You'll find yourself in the tragic position of having to defend every tradition which is native to this particular land. Because they will come and tell you, you're fools, your forefathers were fools, the entire value system that your society has followed for thousands of years is based on myth and superstition and nothing beyond that, and you will not even have credible answers to give, because you don't know who you are and where you come from. Therefore, Indic Renaissance is impossible until we go beyond Twitter and Facebook and equip ourselves with facts, with information, looking at our own history. And it's not really difficult to do. Between the 18th century and early 20th century, giants have literally identified and written fantastic books on India, on India's past. You only need to dig it up. You only need to arm yourself with those facts. You only need to recraft it and represent it. Because if you don't do so, all you're left with is post-20th century and 21st century books, all of which has been written by others, with a specific agenda and a specific interest to push. And this is one aspect that I think becomes very, very important, which is almost in every fight or in every initiative, you will find yourself alone. It either becomes a caste-related issue or it becomes, let's say, a region-related issue or a language-related issue, but it never transcends beyond that. Hopefully, there will come a time where we will recognize that if we do not find for ourselves a common identity, we will be picked apart one by one, and we will not even know it. Riots happen in Gujarat against a certain community. It matters to people from that particular faith across the country, across the world. Riots happen with respect to a different community in Bengal. It doesn't matter to anyone who lives in the neighboring state of Bengal. It doesn't make news at all. It doesn't shake a single soul. It doesn't stir a single conscience. How many of you have heard of Dhulagad riots in Bengal? Were there any protests for those people in this part of the country? While there are protests for Rohingyas all over the country who don't even belong to this country. The turnout for this topic is perhaps representative of the state of affairs. Apathy is the beginning of destruction of a civilization. After years of going through nasty experience from 700 AD till perhaps even today, we still haven't learned our lessons. You may not be interested in your identity as a Hindu or whatnot, but somebody else seems to be interested in your identity as a Hindu. Somebody else is interested in your identity as a Sikh. Somebody else is interested in your Indic identity. His identity may have never mattered to you, your identity may have never mattered to you, you're happy living with the other person, but he is not comfortable with your identity. And yet, you wish to live under the bubble, under the rock, that I'm so sorry, all points of view are the same, all opinions are the same, all worldviews are the same, all values are the same. If no two people can be the same, and no two people can have the same quality, how can two people have the same quality of opinions? How can the quality of opinions of two different people be the same? The problem is we have somehow managed to imbibe this particular tradition that do not judge thy neighbor. Because the moment you judge, you're seen as discriminating, you're seen as subscribing to a fascist ideology. It is important to judge. It is important to apply your faculties of discrimination to see what is right, what is wrong, who is right and who is wrong. Because if you can't speak the truth, if you do not have the guts to speak the truth, then you deserve to wither away. And you will. Most people, at least on our side, have this tendency to keep looking at Israel for an example. Look at them, they've managed to create a state for themselves. They've managed to create an identity for themselves. Do you think that has happened without a problem? They were pushed to the brink of extinction. They lost 6 million people in one fell swoop within a period of 6 years. And then they realized, if I don't stand up for myself, I'm going to be wiped out for eternity. Do we really want us to be pushed to that point before we learn our lessons and be reduced to a state whose size is less than the state of New Jersey? Israel, from one end to another, will not take more than 2 hours to traverse. That country is smaller than the state of New Jersey. A community which was otherwise the original inhabitants of that entire region has been reduced to that one small triangle, a sliver of a triangle in that particular place. Ask yourself, is our position any different? What were our borders before 1947? Where are we today? What is the consequence of alteration of demographics thanks to illegal immigration that's happening in this country? Let me see, and let's see where we are. How many people do you think are illegal immigrants in this country from Bangladesh? How many illegal Bangladeshis do you think are in this country? A rough figure would help. That will tell us what we actually know of the situation. Sorry? 2 to 3 crores was a figure given in early 2000s. Today we are looking at 6 to 7 crores. There was a time when this problem was limited only to the northeast of the country, and we've always given stepmotherly treatment to the northeast, therefore it didn't make too much of a difference to us. But it is now no more a problem that is limited to the northeast. Look at the statistics, look at the figures, and you'll ask yourself, what is happening? In your lifetime, this country and this society will change, and this will no more be the place that you will even recognize. You go to Assam and you ask any Assamese, he will tell you, less than 40% of that state has native Indians. The rest come from Bangladesh. We may be thinking that we helped the creation of Bangladesh and therefore they are grateful to us. But we don't understand that Bangladesh was previously East Pakistan. So they made a choice in 1947. They carved for themselves a certain identity in 1947. Merely because they separated from West Pakistan doesn't change their original decision to stay away from secular India. Why is this important? Because as far as we are concerned, since we have told ourselves that we don't have a specific identity, we don't seem to have a problem with illegal immigration also. Because then we'll immediately cite an ancient Indian tradition. Atithi Devo Bhava, they have to come. How can we behave like this as far as these people are concerned? We have welcomed the Jews, we have welcomed the Afghans, we have welcomed the Tibetans. Why can't we welcome these people? Have Tibetans killed you? In all the years that Tibetans have lived in this country since the invasion of their country, have you heard one riot between Tibetans and Indians? At least in the name of religion. Jews have been living in this country for millennia. They too are a monotheistic faith. Have you heard of one problem between Jews and non-Jews? Parsis have lived in this country. They perhaps constitute the best definition of a minority because today their population is 60,000 and even going down. You've never had a problem as far as they are concerned. So how is it that a position with respect to one particular group is immediately interpreted as an anti-minority position when I don't seem to have a problem with any other minority? They are minorities in the true sense of the word. What does this tell you? And I have to impress upon you this important aspect. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, those places where you would have comfortably been in a position to celebrate your festivals or enjoy your traditions and customs, today you need permission in those places to celebrate your own festivals. what has happened in Calcutta, what has happened in West Bengal, and the need for judicial intervention for you to be able to carry out your own processions and to celebrate your own festival is a wake-up call for the rest of the country. If you do not wake up right now, in your own lifetime, you will find 1,000 warmongers and barbarians standing outside your home and asking you to give up or give up your faith, give up your life or give up your faith. And if I don't know if how many people are even following the news in Kerala. Every day, almost 15 girls are being shipped to Syria. Almost 15 girls on a daily basis. Please wake up to these things for the simple reason that if you think India is only a place where you earn a degree and run away to the West, perhaps the future will, the next generation will not even have an India to do so. You will not be in a position to do that either. Importantly, you can leave this country and run from one country to another, but can you abandon your identity altogether? That will continue to hound you. And someone who has a problem with your fundamental identity, it doesn't make a difference to him whether you're in India or any other place. As long as you don't give up that particular identity, he's going to come after you. Therefore, an Indic Renaissance is not an academic discussion. It is not a discussion meant for, let's say, wine tasting rooms, or it's not a discussion meant for just books. It has a very real relevance to the existential issues that face this country today. So my request would be that we need to choose for ourselves how do we wish to contribute to this Renaissance in one way or the other. You can either be the financiers of this particular movement, or you can be the influencers of this particular movement. You can be the thought leaders of this particular movement, or you can be the grassroots activist. But you must take part in this particular movement in one way or the other, because if you don't do so, your children will not live in the same India that you lived. And you certainly don't live in the same India that your parents lived. So as far as I'm concerned, action is most important. Choose for yourselves one area where you think you're in a better position to contribute, and focus on contributing it in one way or the other. Me, as part of my work, and my team have chosen the legal and the constitutional means to contribute in whichever small way that we can, to push forth our point of view. To push forth the point of view that the space for an Indic identity is being encroached increasingly, and there must be a constitutional resistance to it, and that's what we are doing. Please choose for yourself a certain forum, a certain field of activity, a certain area of expertise, and dig deep into it, and make sure that you contribute to it in one way or the other. One of my most favorite statements is, if you can't be a Rana Pratap, at least be a Bhamasha. If you can't fight in the field of battle, at least help those people who are taking the fire on a regular basis. There is strength in numbers, and therefore numbers matter, and therefore demographics matter. We are willing to treat everybody as our equal, and for us it doesn't make a difference who comes from what faith, but it seems to matter to the other side, unfortunately so. So wake up to this reality and find an area where you can contribute to the Indic Renaissance in one way or the other. Questions, please.
I have two questions actually.
Please.
One is, there is this statement that is always made. Hinduism is not a religion, but a way of living.
Right.
What is your take on this statement? That is one. And the other is, everything that you said now basically resonates from the reason that we ourselves don't know what our history is. And the big reason for this is the school textbooks.
Correct.
I realized what crap my school textbook was
Correct.
after I started reading after college the other books.
Correct.
And I don't see anything being done about the school textbooks.
Correct.
So how do we go about making a change in this
Brilliant questions.
fundamental?
I'll answer both these questions one by one. The first question was with respect to whether Hinduism is just a way of life or not. That judgment was delivered in the context of what? Ramakrishna Mission running to the Supreme Court saying, I'm a minority institution. I'm not a part of mainstream Hinduism. Therefore, please recognize me as a minority institution, as a non-Hindu institution. They did so because they wanted to avoid the torture of the communist government in West Bengal, which was going after Hindu institutions. And therefore, they wanted the protection of minorityism, and that's why they went for this declaration in the first place. Now, as part of the discussion in the judgment on this particular issue, this line figures in the discussion where the court is asking itself whether the term religion can be strictly applied to Hinduism or not. Is the word dharma the same as religion? Is the question that the court was asking itself. And it came out to the conclusion that the concept of religion as we understand it today is a notion imported from Judeo-Abrahamic traditions, which are very different from what we think of dharma here. I'll give you a simple example. Christ never called himself a Christian. Okay? Even Nanak did not call himself a Sikh. Zoroaster never called himself a Zoroastrian. But one gentleman called himself a certain identity, gave himself a certain identity. What does this tell you? As far as we are concerned, as far as the Indic identity is concerned, we have never deemed it fit to give our way of life a bracket of a certain religion until we were forced to take up this identity, because the word Hindu itself is not something that comes from us. You'll only find Sanatan Dharma everywhere, but you'll not find Hindu anywhere. It comes from Sindh, and therefore somebody said, anyone who lives within the, or on this side of Sindh is a Hindu. That's how it came about. Therefore, the Supreme Court, when it says that Hinduism is a way of life, did not take away the status of Hinduism as a faith. It was only meant to say that Hinduism as a faith is not the same as any other religion. However, under Article 26, where it speaks of rights of religious denominations of the Constitution, all Hindu communities or all Hindu denominations are treated as religious denominations for the purposes of Article 26. Assuming that Hinduism were not at all a faith, or it were not at all a religion, and it was only a way of life, it would mean that all rights available to religion and religious institutions would not be available to Hindus at all. Therefore, anyone who says that the Supreme Court itself has said that Hinduism is not a religion and is a mere way of life is lying to himself or is lying to others, knowing fully well that's not what the Supreme Court said. Otherwise, let's look at it this way. You don't have rights under Article 25 because yours is not a religion in the first place, it's just a way of life. Your religious institutions don't have the right to run their own administration because, first of all, they don't represent a religion in the first place. So that's not right. That was a statement made only to distinguish Hinduism from other faiths. Second, as far as books are concerned, textbooks are concerned, I have to say this, that the party with the difference which came to power has turned out to be no different and is perhaps even worse. Because in the last 3 years that it has been in power, I have not seen a single credible initiative being taken to alter textbooks. And this is, again, it goes back to the same thing because they're scared of media backlash. They are scared of the backlash from the ecosystem, the intellectual ecosystem which the other side has created. And since you're not in a position to respond to it, you've chosen to live with the status quo as opposed to mustering the guts to do something about it. Therefore, you'll come out with symbolic gestures once in a while, saying, let's introduce Sanskrit in the CBSE system again and replace German with Sanskrit. But beyond that, you have done nothing. There is an alternative suggestion which most of us have actually proposed. At least 2,000 to 3,000 schools exist, which are run by organizations which are not minority institutions. If those organizations and those schools choose to come out with a new board in themselves, then they can decide the curriculum for that particular board. Your problem is when you try to change the existing curriculum which applies to CBSE, NCERT and all these books which apply to everyone. why can you not push for a new board and a new curriculum that applies to yourself? You don't wish to read our textbooks? No problem. You don't wish to subscribe to our version of history? I don't have a problem. But why are you imposing your version of history on me? I must have the right to choose myself, and therefore, I am interested in creating a parallel universe where there are at least 2,000 to 3,000 institutions. The DAVs and all the schools run by, let's say, Indic cultural organizations, let's call it that way. If all those institutions come together, you have at least 3,000 schools. So that's one way of going about it. Do not hope for any delivery of goods on the civilizational front from this dispensation, at least at this point of time. That's my lesson, and I learned this lesson in the first year or the second year. Because at the end of the day, any political party, regardless of which ideological view it subscribes to, is interested only in remaining in power. And to the extent they're able to distinguish themselves from the others, so that they can say, this is how different I am from the other side, and to the extent that it helps them get votes, they will do so. But beyond that, you cannot expect any credible initiative. Unfortunately, you're not interested in history. An average parent is not interested in history. They're only interested in mathematics, physics, science, computer science, and whatnot. So history curriculum is not something that's going to bother anyone, and nobody is going to lose sleep over it. If my son doesn't know good English, I will have a problem with it. But if my son doesn't know Indian history and doesn't know good history, it really doesn't make a difference to me. So since this is again a storm in a teacup, it's the concern of a minority, it really doesn't make a difference. So the only way is for a large number of people to realize that history makes a difference to how we see ourselves in the long run. Products of these schools who come out with these thoughts that there is nothing to Hinduism beyond casteism, beyond sati, beyond burning widows, and beyond widows living in Varanasi and all these things. If we don't realize the dangers of cultivating the next generation which comes up with these kind of thoughts, then I don't see what's the solution. The only way to do this is for these people to branch out altogether. One more thing. Here the problem, I think, is also with control of temples from a different reason. A church can run its own school. Why can't a temple be in a position to run its own educational institution? So that it can further its own traditions, create its own textbooks, explain the history of that particular place to the people who live in that particular place, but then again, it's in the hands of the government. Release of the temple from the hands of the government will open the doors to a lot of things. You will have the resources to fight fraudulent conversions. You will have the resources to take care of orphans. Look at it this way. If orphans, by and large, are adopted by institutions of a certain community, and they're constantly told that other communities are either evil or they are casteist and whatnot, their loyalties to this particular land will be shaken, and they will grow up as deracinated, rootless people who don't owe any allegiance to this particular country. That's the fact. Therefore, if you need those resources, you need to fight. Next question, please. You had a question, ma'am. You had a question? Yes.
I am from Kerala. From where did you get the source that 15 girls are being shipped? Means it is not being told.
Yes, it's not being told, and there's a good reason for it.
No, why? From where?
The source, I'll tell you. Okay. Have you been following what's happening with Arsha Vidya Samajam in Kerala for the last 3 days? You've been following it? Right. Right. So Arsha Vidya Samajam is an organization in Kerala which has been trying to bring back girls who have been brainwashed going into Syria and becoming concubines of the ISIS. And they're being brought back to their parents. And that center, which is basically a yoga center and a meditation center, is playing the beautiful role of trying to tell them the benefits of remaining in the Hindu fold and what it offers to women. 3 days ago, there was a crackdown on that particular institution, and the entire state machinery decided to go after it on the basis that you do not have the license to undertake the formal process of reconversion. How dare you do this? And on that legality, legal action has been initiated against this organization. One, I have been tracking this particular development, and I've also been speaking to the people who are actually involved in this. These are grassroots activists who are helping these girls find their way back. So I think 3 or 4 days ago, you must have seen the interview of a girl on Times Now as well as on Republic, who says why she has come back to the fold. So she is a product of this particular institution. So the ground activist is basically saying, I have been living with this reality. His name is Mr. Manoj, K.R. Manoj. And he's been saying that I've been living with this reality for such a long time. Second, I'll again go to a very politically incorrect statement. There is a reason why all of a sudden this has become hot news. It's not as if this is a new development. The fact that this has been going on for at least 10 years, even before ISIS came about, is something that most Hindus of Kerala are aware of. But the fact that so far this was happening only with the Hindu girls did not make a difference to anyone. Then the organization that was inducting them into Islam and actually sending them as concubines to ISIS started going after non-Hindu, non-Muslim girls, which is the next community, which is the majority community in Kerala. So they started raising their voice saying, now our girls are being affected. And since they started raising their voice, you can't ignore their voice. You can ignore a Hindu voice, but you can't ignore a non-Hindu voice. So all of a sudden, this has now come into the limelight. So my source of information is the grassroots activist who's fighting this particular menace on a day-to-day basis, and there are threats to his life as well. So this is my source of information. There is no state machinery that has undertaken this analysis because they've dismissed it all through. They have dismissed the existence of this phenomenon all through. For the first time, somebody has woken up to the existence of this phenomenon. That's my source. Do you want, okay, since it's an adult audience, I'll give an adult answer, sir. Yes, sir. For the simple reason, boys for a different reason, but they're primarily going after girls. They're very clear about it. And here there's a problem also. They are going after girls whose parents live in the Gulf and who either live here with their grandparents and or with their friends, and they have all the money in the world. They don't have anybody to oversee them or to monitor them as to what's going on, and therefore they become a prey. But the reason why they're going after girls, and this is how a demographic war is waged. There are two categories of vultures who I would put in two different baskets. One who harvest souls, so I would call them soul vultures. And the second category would be people who harvest wombs, the womb vultures. There is a beautiful book that has been written by a professor from Harvard, I forget his name, on why is the woman seen as the forebearer of civilization? Why is the woman so central to the existence of a civilization? Because if the woman is targeted, you target the ecosystem which depends on the existence of the women. And therefore, the progeny which comes out of that women will automatically subscribe to the values of that particular women. There is a reason why women were, so there are two fantastic examples for this. We have only heard of mass rapes and mass riots happening in the partition scenario. There was another thing that happened as well. After Soviet Russia entered Germany, post the defeat of Germany, the first thing that the Russian soldiers did, the Red Army soldiers did, was to go and rape en masse German women. To do two things. One, to humiliate that particular race is one goal, by shaming their women. And that's exactly what the Pakistani army did with the Bengali Hindus and Bengali Muslims during the 1970s. Second, is to say that if I have that women, what comes out of that women is a product of my faith or a product of my worldview. That's the reason they're going after them. If I say this in any public forum, this is no less a public forum, but if I say this in a media platform or anywhere else, I'll be branded a fascist for saying this. But this is a target. Taslima Nasreen put out a tweet a few days ago saying, 16,000 Rohingya women who are in India are all pregnant, and the average number of children that each Rohingya woman seems to be giving birth to is 7 to 10. It's like a litter. So for somebody to say, there are only 40,000 people, what's your problem? Why are you making a fuss about it? Let them go on with their lives peacefully. India has a culture of hospitality, let's take care of them. This number will mushroom, and then you won't know what to do. Ladakh and Jammu are the only places which are now relatively secure because the demographics are still in your favor. Have you ever asked yourself, why is it that Rohingyas are concentrating in Jammu and not in Kashmir? Why are, out of the 40,000 Rohingyas in this country, close to 16,000 are in Jammu region alone? Why? Change the demographic. There's a reason for it. You have effectively lost the Northeast, you have lost Kashmir, you are bound to lose Jammu and Ladakh. When the Hindu was saying that our women are being carried away, there was a problem. Now Buddhists of Ladakh are raising the same issue. Now call him a communist and call him a communal fascist, and let's see what happens next. So targeting of women is not random. There is a clear strategy behind it, and there is a clear thought behind it. The worst part is, the opposite side is bloody committed to what it wants to do. They're absolutely committed to their goals. They're crystal clear in what their goals are. We are not even clear as to our identity, forget goals. So where is the question of us actually matching them man to man, woman to woman, fight to fight? That's not going to happen in the near future. Yes, please.
Hello. Sir, actually, the Breaking India forces are a threat to Indian renaissance.
Right.
As far as the problem with this part of the country is concerned, after the demise of CM, I mean, Madam
Right.
Jayalalitha,
Right.
the voice of the Breaking India forces are
Stronger.
never been this louder.
Correct.
After the arrest of May 17 movement organizer, Mr. Tirumurugan Gandhi,
Right.
after he has been arrested on the charges of Gundas Act, if I am right, and after those act has been removed from charges have been removed by
Right.
the High Court, then he was released. And after that, as soon as he comes out of the jail, in the gates of the jail, he is giving a statement that the Indian country is waging a war against Tamilians.
Tamils. Correct.
Okay. So he's boldly giving as soon as he has been released from the jail.
Correct. Correct.
So, do you think there is a need for much more stricter sedition laws? Because I read your article on sedition laws
Right.
during the JNU issue.
Right.
Do you think we are not, the sedition laws are not sufficient to address this issue?
See, law can only complement social efforts. It cannot succeed in isolation. So even if you were to come out with a stronger sedition law or implement or enforce the existing sedition law in a stricter fashion, it would make very less difference for the simple reason that I read a banner, and that banner was sent to me, which says, Hindus, get out of Tamil Nadu. This is the land of Tamils, not Hindus. So today we are now creating an identity saying that Tamils have never been Hindus. That Sangamira was only about Buddhism, Jainism, and had got nothing to do with Hinduism at all. Hindu festival. So the thing is, every festival has only become a commercial activity, but its religious basis is being slowly secularized, which means it's being de-Hinduized. That's happening. Right. And see, all of this happens for the simple reason that the gatekeepers of academia are people who come from a certain ideology. Imagine you're a student who's pursuing your PhD, and there are so many people here. The acceptance of your thesis is dependent on there being a resonance between your wavelength and your guide's wavelength. And if the wavelength, or let's say the guide happens to be someone who's particularly rigid about his ideological standpoints, and your area of research is something that relates to that ideological standpoint, your career is in his hands. You think all of these people truly believe what they write? They don't. Some of them do it because it's a question of survival. And then they realize that if I don't subscribe to this point of view, I will be kicked out of this ecosystem. I will never be made a part of this ecosystem. I can never aspire for greener pastures. I will never get a recommendation for a Fulbright scholarship or a Rhodes scholarship abroad as far as my future is concerned. So I might as well do this. The problem lies there, which is why, again, it goes back to an intellectual renaissance. Two, the absence of a strong voice today in the public forum which can silence these anti-India voices, anti-Indic voices, has now allowed people who call themselves foster children of rationalists to enter the fray and make even more nasty statements. So the only way for this, or I think the only way forward, is for you to start talking about the Hindu side of the Tamil culture as well. Unfortunately, that side is completely lost. We may be happy going to temples on festivals, but the fact that somebody is assailing those traditions in a public platform on a regular basis still doesn't inspire a response from the community. We will all respond to attacks on our caste, but we will never respond to attacks on your faith. That is the reality. If somebody hurts me personally or affects my caste identity, I will go after that person. There will be a riot for that. But when somebody openly slanders against your faith, you will conveniently remain silent and you'll dissociate yourself from that particular position because you'll say, I don't care, it doesn't matter to me. Therefore, that sense of apathy as far as your Hindu identity is concerned or your Indic identity is concerned is partly responsible. And here, perhaps you'll have to blame the previous generation for not instilling those values in you, or to tell you that this identity matters, it's important, be proud of it. You need not hate somebody else. You need not grow up with hatred of any other community. But surely there's nothing wrong in you growing up being proud of your community. And not just about your caste identity, but something that goes beyond that. So a sedition law, if you implement it, any government that does that will be branded a fascist government, will be branded an anti-democratic government, because in this country, democracy is equal to anarchy. The freedom to say anything is equated as democracy and the right to free speech. So which government would want to do that? You will immediately become unpopular. Media houses will come after you. Pechurumai will become the talk of the town. So as far as I am concerned, sedition law alone is not going to help. You will need to find a societal response to each of these issues. Only then law will have some sanctity, because the society is saying, I will not accept this behavior anymore, and I am more than happy to penalize it. I'll go to one more unpopular incident. What happened on the eve of Avaniyatam? Why was it treated as an incident that applies to only one particular caste? Does only one caste wear the Yajñapamit? Vishwakarmas don't wear it. Balija Naidus don't wear it. Kamavari Naidus don't wear it. So many castes in this state who are non-Brahmin castes wear that particular sacred thread. But it was, nobody responded to it. Not one person responded to it. And mind you, each of these voices is being funded and encouraged by somebody else who's not necessarily from the Indic background. Kindly read up the history of the rationalist movement and the self-respect movement, and you will see some of the biggest proponents of that movement have been non-Hindus. Because it is in their benefit, it's in their interest. At least some of them, not all of them. I don't believe that everybody subscribes to that point of view, but some institutions certainly do.
Sir, it's relatively easier to counter the Muslims because you can point to the Kashmiri Pandit exodus or Bashir Hart or any riot, because they are actively involved in this arms and all. Means they carry on a fight against you. They are there to kill you basically. But the Christians, they fight a passive war. I mean, take for example the Kundakulam plant. Baptist Church funded the whole movement, which surprisingly garnered the support of the poor people over there, because they said that the radiations might harm you.
Correct.
So I don't see any.
Can I respond to it? I'll have to clarify two things. It's best not to ascribe these motives to all Muslims or all Christians. I don't think that should be done, and for a different reason altogether. For the simple reason, one of my colleagues in the Indic collective is a Christian who knows the Vishnu Sahasranamam and Indian or Hindu scriptures better than most Hindus I know, and who is actively part of every initiative which is pro-Indic. And what does this tell you? People can be changed. What needs to be fought is a mindset. What needs to be countered is an idea. What needs to be countered is an ideology. Now, there is a saying, and just to address your example, one is a tiger, the other is a snake. You need to be in a position to fight both the tiger and the snake, which means you must have the wherewithal to resist direct confrontation, you must also have the mental agility to fight the intellectual battle. One thing that you must note, until the Britishers set foot in this country, Hindus may have lost battle after battle, war after war, but they never lost respect for their faith or their roots or their Hindu identity. They lost nothing. Because whoever came here with the intention of converting you wanted to kill you, and he wanted to finish you or convert you, but he never came out with a mechanism to fundamentally tell you that you're inferior through education, through colonization. And that is what 200 years of British rule did, where systematically the education system was taken over. You were deprived of the ability to bear arms. You were also deprived of the ability to carry on your traditional knowledge systems, coupled with the fact that he co-opted you by saying some of you belong to us and therefore you come from the Aryan race and some of you come from an inferior race. So he managed to successfully create a divide as far as your own identity is concerned. Therefore, what needs to be countered, and I'll always welcome an open confrontational adversary as opposed to the sweet talking person who has an agenda and who's slowly pushing that agenda. I'll give you one more example. The December vacation has become perhaps the longest vacation in most places. Between the 22nd of December and the 1st of January has become perhaps the longer vacation of all other festival vacations. Automatically, you make that particular period attractive for school-going children, for office-going people, and whatnot. They start looking forward to that particular event. Even the Sunday holidays. What does this tell you? This is silent. This is subtle. And it needs to be countered in a very subtle way. Do we have more time for questions?
So I have a question. I found your talk a bit having hatred particular community. You didn't name that community, but you said like some community, people from some religion, and even you told them as barbarians.
Right.
And you made two statements also.
Yes.
One is that there is like 15 girls from Kerala will go to Syria. Okay, what is that like? And for that you give authentication that it is a groundwork done by some particular person.
Correct.
You name him, who is working with some ashram or some organization.
Right.
And how much is the authenticity?
We don't know.
That organization. No,
Therefore-
that's not the organization.
Yeah, yeah.
And second thing you told about change the demography of Jammu and Kashmir,
Correct.
for which you told that Rohingyas are there and it is with the intention of change the demography.
Correct.
On that I have counter question, like I'm from Jammu and Kashmir, for
Yeah.
information, and there are also West Pakistan refugees also.
Right.
So I think it will be better like if would have come on that thing also. And one more thing that you said that like there was a tweet by some person, Taslima Nasreen,
Correct.
who has said that like these are pregnant and will give birth to 7 and 8 children, something like that.
Right.
Like to what extent you can find these statements authentic?
Grateful. I'm very grateful for this question. So I'll answer each of these questions. So I'll actually use the tweet of General Atta Hasnain, who has served in Jammu and Kashmir, who's proud of his faith, and who's very clearly said that Rohingyas are a threat to the security of this country because the stateless people lend themselves as an instrumentality of aggression against India in the hands of anti-Indian agencies. He has made this statement. Now, I assume that as a layperson, someone who has served in the security forces, who has been part of the intelligence apparatus, is certainly better positioned to make these statements than you or me put together. He is working with the organization. Yes, Vivekananda India Foundation. Therefore he is suspect. So everybody is lying. No, my point is, if authenticity is the question, if authenticity is the issue, on what basis do you trust any of the news reports that come about massacre of a certain community in Gujarat? At the end of the day, the affidavits which were filed before the Supreme Court saying that fetuses were ripped, people were killed, all of this was ultimately proved to be a lie. Teesta Setalwad's affidavit even before the Supreme Court turned out to be a lie. So what is the truth? Therefore, if that's the point of view, don't believe any source, and therefore don't form an opinion based on any of these news reports. Go do your own research. If that's the statement that we wish to make, then none of us should form an opinion based on anything that we read. Second, if your question is about West Pakistan and refugees coming from West Pakistan, I'll make a very clear statement because that's the position that we've taken in the Supreme Court in our intervention petition also, seeking deportation of Rohingyas, very clearly saying, India is the natural home for people coming from Indic faiths. If it's a Buddhist or a Jain or a Sikh or a Hindu who comes from Bangladesh, Pakistan, Balochistan, Afghanistan, Canada, or any other place, India is the natural home for these people. I am not saying that this is not the natural home for anybody else, but I certainly have the right to say who this country belongs to as opposed to saying who doesn't belong to this country. Who is supposed to give this right? No, who is supposed to give this right? And have you read the notifications that have come out under the Foreigners Act with respect to who is supposed to get a long-term visa? I'm so sorry. Constitution, as far as India is concerned, is the result of a decision taken by the majority of this country that we will give ourselves this identity. It doesn't take away the identity of this country or the cultural origins of this country. Please understand, it's not just about the majority. No, it's not about the majority. I'm saying a different point. People of all religions and people who don't belong to this country don't have an equal right as far as this country is concerned. Let's be very clear about that. If you're an alien and if you do not belong to this particular country, you do not have the right to expect equal treatment at par with any other citizen. That's the verdict of the Supreme Court. You may have the right to be treated with dignity, but you don't have the right to settle in this country. Secondly, India certainly has the right to take a position that we have always been the home to people belonging to certain faiths, and therefore, if they are persecuted in any other part of the world, this shall be the place where they will find asylum and refuge. Secondly, in fact, thirdly, after 1970 and after the infiltration of refugees and illegal immigrants, after the creation of Bangladesh, you have a live example in front of you where the illegal immigration has resulted in the loss of native cultures, in the loss of indigenous cultures, which the Supreme Court of this country has recognized in 3 decisions. If you want the latest decision, 2014, December 2014, writ petition 562 of 2012, Ranjan Gogoi and Justice Rohington Nariman. Read the decision, and the Supreme Court has recognized the devastating effects of allowing illegal immigrants coming from certain parts, having a certain identity on the land, on the culture of this land. Therefore, if you wish to discuss constitution and constitutional rights, the Supreme Court, the highest constitutional court of this country, has endorsed this position. So read it. Of course, it has taken. Foreigners' tribunals have been constituted. The court has said this categorically, saying between 1961 and 65, over 1 lakh illegal immigrants have been deported from this country. But from 1981 to 85, less than 2,000 people, and in the last 2 years, less than 33 people. Therefore, the court has categorically said that for political reasons, people are not being sent out of this country because they've become vote banks in the hands of parties who are interested in pampering and cultivating them. Therefore, if you wish to really discuss constitution, I would suggest you do a bit more of reading on this particular front. What the court has said with respect to India's identity, let me put it this way. I'll make 3 factual statements, and I'd like to see which of these factual statements can be rebutted. Judaism did not originate in India. Fact or not? Judeo-Abrahamic traditions do not come from India. Fact or not? Buddhism comes from India. Fact or not? Sikhism comes from India. Fact or not? Vedic traditions come from India. Fact or not? Sangam traditions come from India. Fact or not? Charvaka traditions come from India. Fact or not? Can the Constitution change history? It cannot. Can the Constitution change the history of humanity? It cannot. Can the Constitution change and negate the existence of a certain historical experience? It dare not, it cannot, it has not. Therefore, Constitution only says that those who live in this country shall be treated equally, but it does not go on to say that the government will not have the right to decide who can enter this country and who cannot. In fact, the Constitution clearly says that the government's power under the Foreigners Act of 1946 is supreme, and its right to expel illegal immigrants cannot be interfered with. Yes. And refugees are who? Why not? Why not? So we are supposed to turn a blind eye to the entire experience that the Northeast has gone through for the simple reason that we want to be seen as being equal, and we will put at risk our own existence for illegal refugees. Yes. That's exactly the point. Our problem is not that the government is doing everything. The fact is the government has not done. You go and ask a Bengali and someone who's lived in Bengal, you'll ask him and he'll tell you this thing. Since the 1970s, there has been a state-sponsored policy of giving ration cards and state resources to illegal immigrants coming from the other side of the border. And you ask, and since you raised the issue of religion, let me just educate you on that front just one bit. The lead petitioner in the Assam petitions is not a Hindu, is a Muslim by the name Mutahir Hussain, who is saying that I, as an Assamese Muslim, have a problem with the fact that all these people come into this country, they create law and order issues, and I get branded as a communal fascist, and my entire faith gets branded because of the acts of these people. This is a Muslim making the statement. It's not a Hindu making the statement. His name is Mutahir Hussain. You should ask yourself, why is it that every time we raise questions with respect to the identity of this country, we are hell-bent on denying the origins of this country, the traditions of this country, and where we come from? I just put 7 different questions to you as to which faith belongs to this country, which faith doesn't belong to this country, or which faith has not originated in this country. You have not been able to give an answer to the negative for each of these questions. What does that say? Constitution is not meant to erase history. Constitution is only meant to say, notwithstanding what may have happened in the past, people will be treated with equality and dignity. But that doesn't mean that we'll commit the same mistake for the next 1,000 years and pay the price for it. I think I've said enough.
Thank you very much for the... Thank you very much, sir, for the enlightening talk. And now, I would like to call upon stage Professor Verma for our faculty advisor to appreciate our guest on the behalf of IIT Madras with a memento.
Before I give a memento, I think audience are very few here, but I think he has done a good job awakening us and also giving some of the facts of our lifetime. And I share one thing with you. My son has gone for undergraduate in US, and the first thing he has to learn the American history. So this is the one thing we should know, that we have not doing our children regarding what he said. We are always think about physics, chemistry, and math, and that's what we are. But we have not learned the history. And I think this is the one thing we, in the future, I think we should teach our children about the history of India. And that will help us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank our guest for taking out his precious time and addressing us on the vital topic. Thank you to all the faculty members and especially the audience here to joining with us. Now we have come to the end of the session. So this session will not end till we do national anthem with us. Please stand up. नमन दिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उत्कल जलधि तरंगा तब शुभ नामे जागे, तब शुभ आशीष मांगे, गाहे तब जय गाथा, जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता, जय हे जय हे जय हे, जय 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 हे. Once again, thank you very much. I'd like to call upon faculty members and Professor Verma sir to take a picture photograph with our guest and all the group members too.